This is what we think of when we consider jihad. We think of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. But in reality, this is far from what is actually a noble and peaceful idea. Instead, these terrorist groups have taken the spirit behind it and corrupted it with an ideological approach. We perceive it in this way likely because we are uninformed and we never bothered to earnestly chase down the truth about what jihad means. Our experts told us that it was terrorism, and our news media sources also told us that it was terrorism, and we believed them.
The truth is, this is done in the name of Islam. This is a literal interpretation of the Quran. It is the call to jihad. It is the infidels. It is holy war. It is take neither Christians nor Jews for your friends. It's about the literal interpretation of the Quran. It's about the perversion of Islam, correct? That's just a fact.
It is easy to fall into an argument like Sean Hannity's and believe that there is only one side to jihad, a side represented by this image that is violent and extreme and unnuanced. However, this is wrong. As Qasim Rashid, spokesman of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA, describes, contrary to what extremists and anti-Muslim personalities claim, the word jihad does not mean to wage holy war or to kill the infidel or to commit terrorism. The word jihad means to struggle. The Prophet Muhammad said the best jihad was to speak words of truth in front of a tyrannical leader. The Harvard Divinity School also helps us understand the concept of jihad by unpacking its complexity. They write, Muslims are sharply divided among themselves in their understandings of jihad, an Arabic term meaning struggle. In one reading, jihad might refer to legally sanctioned defensive armed combat against one's enemies. Some Muslims have understood jihad in ethical terms, conceiving of it as a person's inner struggle against the impulses of the ego, such as greed, anger, and jealousy, what the Prophet Muhammad himself referred to as the greater jihad. In another sense, some Muslims consider jihad to be a human being's struggle to fulfill one's obligations to family and society. In the context of the modern nation-state, jihad has been used to refer to a state-sponsored program that is non-military in nature. When we consider this, we realize that a perspective such as ISIS's is not the only one when it comes to jihad. Additionally, we can see it from the totally opposite perspective that Qasim Rashid presents again. He reiterates that the Quran describes 3 types of jihad, struggles, and 0 of them mean or permit terrorism. These are the jihad against yourself, the jihad against Satan, which are called the greater jihads, and the jihad against an open enemy, known as the lesser jihad. He then argues that the Quran, chapter 22, verse 40, specifically commands Muslims to engage in this lesser jihad to protect churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques from attack. The 2014 film Timbuktu reveals to the non-Muslim world the internal Islamic tension regarding the concept of jihad. On the one hand, it shows us the perspective of an imam who represents a peaceful and noble approach to jihad, and on the other hand, we see the extremists who represent the version of jihad that Sean Hannity paints and that ISIS and other terrorist groups actualize. Before jumping into the details of this film, however, I want to note that the difference between jihad and terrorism is only one of the many examples of a relationship between an ideal and its corresponding ideology. In her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt distinguishes these 2 approaches to life. Timbuktu illustrates her ideas particularly well, and I would like to discuss the film as a specific and modern-day example of this divide and use it to shed light on the idea in the abstract. The Imam and the extremists have the same abstract idea in mind, a struggle that brings them and those around them closer to Allah. However, they diverge in what this means and how best to achieve it. The Imam views it in an idealistic way. Everyone should strive to be in constant jihad, in constant improvement. However, this does not mean that everyone must immediately be there or face consequences. Additionally, he does not mistake means for an end. Even though the Quran at times advocates strict laws or violence, the Imam understands that these are always means to bring Muslims closer to Allah. They are not valuable in and of themselves and thus should be used sparingly. We can link his perspective on the ideal behind Islam with Hannah Arendt's description of the legend. She writes, "Legends were the spiritual foundation of every ancient city. Without ever relating the facts reliably, yet always expressing their true significance, they offered a truth beyond realities. Legends, however, are not ideologies. They do not aim at universal explanation, just as the Imam does not aim at universal explanation. Rather, he aims to create a spiritual foundation to guide the citizens of his city on their path to religious enlightenment." The extremists, on the other hand, believe that everyone should already be perfect. They so value the means that they mistake them for the end. For them, violence and decrees please Allah, and they have no inclination to explain the purpose of these acts because they have made them so valuable in and of themselves without considering why the Quran proposes them in the first place. They are stuck in this mode of thought without any leniency because, as Hannah Arendt writes, ideological thinking orders facts into an absolutely logical procedure which starts from an axiomatically accepted premise and proceeds with a consistency that exists nowhere in reality. A scene that illustrates the idealistic and ideological mindset especially well is when one of the head extremists discusses jihad with the Imam. Although we are thrown into the middle of their conversation, we can infer that the Imam has reproached the extremists for their actions. In response to this, the extremist says, However, the Imam, in a careful and subtle way, after all, the extremist is armed, denies that his reproach is anti-jihad, for that would imply that what they are doing can actually be considered jihad. He then makes a statement that the greater jihad is more important than the lesser jihad. Any statement of the form, "I don't have time for X," is a polite way of saying, "I prioritize other things over X," and thus the greater jihad that he does to himself is more important than participating in their group jihad against enemies such as supposedly non-obedient Muslims. He follows this up by saying,
يمكن أن يدعى جهادا لكنت أول المصطفين معكم.
This clause is, at first, puzzling. We cannot sincerely believe that the Imam would ever take up arms alongside the extremists. Instead, it is an accusation wrapped up as a pacifying statement. He is not implying that, if he were to finish his moral improvement, he would become an extremist. He is saying that the only way a so-called Muslim could possibly take up such an awful case is by not being committed to their moral improvement, and, since Allah is the source of all goodness, by not being committed to Him. While the Imam cannot quite come out and say this so forcefully, he does manage to tell the extremist,
أسأل الله تبارك وتعالى عساه أن يغفر لي ويغفر لكم ويعيننا على نبذ العجب والكبرياء. كفاكم كفاكم إنكم تسيئون للإسلام والمسلمين. بترتم يد طفل صغير من أم مسكينة، ورجمتم أم طفلين صغيرين من دون أي بينة واضحة.
After this, the Imam brings up the glove decree in a moment that symbolizes the difference between jihad and extremism and, more generally, between ideal and ideology. He explains to the extremist,
وقبلكم جاءتني هنا امرأة تشتكي من أنكم أنزلتموها لبس القفازين، ها هما، بدون توضيح وتبيين كما أمر الله رسوله أن يبين.
the ideal behind religion is that we can find something greater than humanity to help, explain, and guide our existence, to create better lives on earth and possibly in an afterlife. It is important to note that the ideal behind religion does not claim a complete understanding of the world. It accepts the mystery behind the occurrences of the universe. For example, there is the Jewish joke, man plans and God laughs, which accepts that everyone, even the most learned religious scholars, do not come close to having the universe figured out. Additionally, under this ideal, commandments are not forced on anyone because that misses the point. Every commandment has a reason, a corresponding usefulness, which is what one should aim to communicate to another. Ideology corrupts this take on religion into a prescriptive and unquestionable way of looking at the world. Rather than using religion as a way to grapple with complexity, it seeks to eliminate the complexity. As globalization scholar Manfred Steger describes, ideologies help organize the tremendous complexity of human experiences into fairly simple claims that serve as guide and compass for social and political action. The commandment for women to wear gloves in the movie is likely an oversimplification of something that was indeed intended, even if in a misinformed way, to help people. The extremists take this up unthinkingly and dogmatically force it onto the women of Timbuktu. Because they are blindly following ideology, they do not even consider explaining to anyone the religious reasoning for their decrees. Another example which clarifies this point, although it is not in the movie, is the Abrahamic commandment against pork consumption. We are now far from the origins of this statement, so we can only hypothesize why it exists, but it is not likely that pigs were arbitrarily considered taboo. Instead, Marvin Harris argues that raising pigs in the Middle East therefore was and still is a lot costlier than raising ruminants, because pigs must be provided with artificial shade and extra water for wallowing, and their diet must be supplemented with grains and other plant foods that humans themselves can eat. If we accept this explanation, then there is perfectly good reason to ban pigs. In fact, it is not too far from modern environmental arguments against red meat. We might imagine that an observant group of people noticed the inordinate resource requirement to raise pigs, sounded an alarm, and eventually they were banned. At some point, all that stuck was that pigs were bad, and the simple-mindedness of ideology only transmitted this fact rather than accompanying it with the reason behind it. In this case, just as with the gloves and the rest of the decrees in the movie, the spirit of the ideal was lost. There was a law, but no reason for it was given. A true explanation takes time and effort to convey and to convince others of. A prescription requires no reason and simply needs to be repeated enough times to appear just and true.
kursi sinala da kursi bebeta kursi sinala ne shara kurale ya kursi sinala giga la yele
Returning to the scene, we see that the Imam concludes by asking a series of questions.
فأين هي الرحمة؟ وأين هو العفو؟ وأين هو الاستغفار؟ أين هي الشورى؟ وأين هو التوكل بعد العزم؟
These are questions which could be posed at every judgment and sentence that the extremists make, with the musicians, with the adulterers, and finally with Kadane's capital punishment. The Imam's concept of jihad allows us to see an alternative version of Timbuktu, one in which there are no puzzling situations such as arresting people for singing praise to Allah, one in which daughters are not regrettably orphaned by authority figures, and, most importantly, one in which ideology does not rule supreme. This is a Timbuktu in which nuance matters, a Timbuktu in which exchange, forgiveness, companionship, and community are valued.
la